Welcome to Chapter 8.1, The New Nation. Though Shays' rebellion in August of 1786 is well known to most historians, there was a rebellion about 2 years earlier for very similar reasons, and it's known as the Whiskey Rebellion. In this rebellion, it was the new federal government had committed over 80% of its operating budget to defeating the Indians, but it wasn't able to raise the funds for that, and so it had to find another way to finance this endeavor, and so it decided to tax something that it considered to be a luxury, which was the production of whiskey. Unfortunately, there were families who made their living off of whiskey because they were farmers, and the cost of shipping corn back to the east was so expensive, and it didn't make it profitable to ship corn. But if the family was able to make whiskey in their private still, then they could ship the product back and get more money for it. So it was a better deal. But the Congress decided to tax whiskey, and so it really ended up taxing the poor, and they resented it very, very much. And so when taxmen, or they would call them excisemen, came to try to collect the taxes, they were often violently attacked. This tax actually favored the rich rather than the poor. And some people thought that it was specifically created even by President Washington, who himself was a rich land speculator, that he had made it in order to benefit the rich rather than the poor. But the government ended up sending troops in, about 13,000 men, which was actually a larger group of men than they had during the Revolution. And this attempt by the federal government to put down rebellions in the territories and states around America helped to illustrate the conflict that there was between the states and the federal government. Which one would have more power? The smaller states or a larger federal government? Conflicts like the Whiskey Rebellion and the economic crisis that America was facing after the War of Independence caused many people to start questioning whether the United States needed to have a stronger central government. The Articles of Confederation were just not allowing the government enough freedom or enough power in order to run the country as it needed to be run. During the war, the problem had been inflation. They had continued to print money, even though they didn't have enough gold to back up that money. And so it wasn't uncommon to hear the term "not worth a continental being the dollars that they had printed out. Alexander Hamilton, a New York lawyer and a close associate of George Washington, who had served during the Revolution as Washington's aide, had some very interesting and effective ideas on how to solve the United States economic crisis. He proposed that they allow the central government the opportunity to create permanent revenue from taxation and duties. But unfortunately, immediately after the American War of Independence, most people were not interested in focusing on the federal government. They were interested in going back to the states that they had come from and settling down to enjoy the fruits of all their labor. Unfortunately, after the War of Independence, instead of inflation being the problem, now there was a problem of depression. This meant that there were a lot more products available, but there was no money to buy them. So, and actual bullion or coin pieces had been siphoned off to the merchants from England, because traders who are bringing goods over from England refused to take any other kind of currency. So American coin was greatly diminished. The relationship between Britain and America had always been that America produced the raw materials and they were transported to England and then manufactured and brought back to America to be traded for other raw materials. Well, the British did not, just because the war was fought doesn't mean that the trading relationships ended. And so the British started bringing over all of their extra or old manufactured goods and dumping them on American markets. And they offered very easy terms of credit. But this greatly reduced the amount of trade that, it created something called a deficit, which meant that the trade going out of the United States was less than the trade coming into the United States. And this is actually very bad for the United States. It meant that the United States and Americans were going into debt, and they were unable to dig their way out of it, it seemed like. On top of this, the government was in desperate straits because they were not allowed to raise taxes on their own. And the Confederate Congress had to ask the states for the necessary money that they needed in order to pay back their own debt to nations that they had borrowed from in order to have enough money to conduct a war. And the states were also trying to pay back their individual debts as well. So it was a serious problem. As mentioned before, the Depression happened after the Revolutionary War, and it was caused by a glut of products and not enough money to buy the products. Also, as mentioned before, Britain, I think it was probably as a way to punish or get back at the Americans for their bad taste of having a war of independence, they dumped products onto the American markets and caused a lot of problems for the American economy. Well, repaying of debts can actually be kind of a moral and political as well as an economic problem. If a government chooses to support the consumer rather than the producer, like allowing people to not have to pay back their debts, that would actually cause a lot of problems for the people who had loaned the money or had given the lines of credit. And that would not be protecting private property, which is something that the United States is actually founded upon, one of the principles that is very important to the United States. But this was not necessarily clear during this time period what would happen and how whether the government would support the debtor or the dettee, I guess you could say. Part of the problem was that the states and the federal government were debtors themselves. Farmers and debtors tried to press state governments and the federal government to make laws in which they wouldn't have to pay, or that they could pay back their debts in very diminished currencies, and so technically pay back their debt, but in reality it would have been only a fraction of what it was actually worth. 7 states actually did enable this type of repayment to happen, and of course it made the creditors very angry, but it actually worked out not too badly, and in the end it seemed to be a good solution. But there were other ways of solving this problem. Rhode Island went so far as to allow people to pay back their debts with diminished value currency, and if the creditor would not accept it, then they could deposit their payment with the county judge, and then the judge would declare the debt paid, and they would have to go and collect their debt from the county judge, or just not be able to enforce their own repayment of that debt. This became kind of infamous among the other states because it was seen as pretty cheap, actually, well, literally and figuratively. Some states erected high tariffs to try to stop the importation of goods that were competing with their own domestic goods. And so this, but the problem was that merchants and traders knew exactly how to get around the barriers, and they would just land their goods a little bit farther up the coast and then bring them in by land. So it wasn't a very effective way, and it actually highlighted another issue that that a group called the Nationalists began to voice, and that was that there needed to be a stronger central government that could regulate trade and enable domestic manufacturing to begin to develop. John Adams wrote that the means of preserving ourselves will never be secured entirely until Congress shall be supreme in foreign commerce and shall have digested a plan for all the states. Virginia was kind of the leader in calling for a new convention to discuss some of these economic problems that the early United States was facing. The meeting was kind of sparsely attended. They only had about 12 delegates from 5 states. But the big issue was, what are we going to do? There's all these problems and we need a better solution. Massachusetts, the rebellions in Massachusetts and the Whiskey Rebellion were basically evidence that the government needed more power in order to deal with these disorders. Washington and his fellow delegate from Virginia, James Madison, is noted to have said, "If there exists not a power to check them, what security has a man for life, liberty, and property?" He was speaking from his own experience, where he had to fight for his own lands that he had bought in the West. Washington was known for being a land speculator himself, and he had problems with squatters coming and trying to steal his land from him. The convention became known as the Annapolis Convention, and it passed a resolution which requested that a Confederation Congress call all the states to send a delegate to a national convention, and then they would try to address some of these major problems in the Articles of Confederation and try to come up with a solution.